The ballroom of the Grand Heritage Hotel glittered like a diamond under 1,000 lights. It was the night of the annual Innovators Gala, the biggest event of the season for the city's wealthy and powerful. Everyone who was anyone was there, dressed in their finest, smiling with perfect teeth, and speaking in low, important voices. In the very center of this golden crowd was the Chadwick family. Lawrence Chadwick, the father, stood tall and proud. His smile was wide because his family's company, Chadwick Holdings, was just hours away from signing a deal worth almost $2 billion. It was a merger with a giant tech company called Kronos. This deal would save their old-fashioned industrial empire and make them richer than ever. Next to him was his son, Preston. He was young, confident, and already acting like he owned the world. They moved through the room, accepting handshakes and congratulations, feeling unstoppable. Across the crowded floor, a man named David watched the scene quietly. He stood near a tall window, holding a glass of water. He was the founder and CEO of a company called Verd Systems, which worked on new, clean energy technology. David wasn't flashy. He wore a simple, well-made suit, and his calm eyes took everything in. He was at the gala because an old friend, a very successful fund manager, had invited him. David preferred his lab and his engineers to these loud parties, but he came as a favor. The evening went on with speeches and awards. Then David's friend, the host for the night, stepped up to the main microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "while we celebrate the giants among us, we must also welcome the future. We have a true pioneer with us tonight, a man building the infrastructure of tomorrow. A personal friend of mine, David Adebayo of Verd Systems." David was surprised. This wasn't planned. He gave a small, private sigh, set his glass down, and walked towards the stage. A soft, polite applause followed him. From the Chadwick's table, Lawrence leaned over to Preston. "Who's this?" he muttered, not bothering to hide his confusion. Preston scanned David, his expression turning into a smirk. "Some green energy guy, I think. Solar panels and windmills, probably." They both shared a look that said they thought this was a silly distraction from the real business of the night. David reached the podium. He spoke clearly and without notes. He talked about the urgent need for smart energy, about building systems that didn't harm the planet, and about creating jobs that lasted. His words were thoughtful and strong. The room listened, mostly out of respect for the host. When David finished and asked if there were any questions, Preston Chadwick's hand shot up immediately. A spotlight found him. He stood up, smooth and smiling. "That was a very passionate speech, Mr. Adebayo," Preston began, his tone slick. "It's always inspiring to hear from the more trend-focused sectors." A few people in his circle chuckled softly. "But I have to ask," Preston continued, "for those of us in traditional industries, real industries that build real things, how do you see your vision being anything more than a very expensive hobby for rich idealists? Isn't this all just a little bit fashionable?" The air in the room changed. The polite silence turned tense and uncomfortable. Some guests looked down at their plates. Others stared wide-eyed. It wasn't a real question. It was a public dismissal designed to make David look small and silly on a big stage. David didn't flinch. He looked directly at Preston, then at Lawrence, who was watching with an amused glint in his eye. For a long second, David just held their gaze. Then a small, calm smile touched his lips. It wasn't a friendly smile. It was the smile of a man who knew something they did not. "Interesting perspective," David said, his voice still steady and clear, carrying through the silent hall. "I've always found that the most durable structures, in business or in engineering, are built on strong foundations, not just on top of old, crumbling ones. They're built to last for the future, not just to preserve the past." "Thank you." He gave a slight nod to the audience and walked away from the podium, back to his seat. The applause that followed was louder and more genuine this time, from people who admired his grace under fire, but the Chadwicks didn't hear it. Lawrence clapped Preston on the back, whispering, "Well handled, son. These new guys need to learn their place." They laughed together, believing they had won a little victory. They saw David as a bug on the windshield of their speeding limousine, an insignificant smear. They had no idea. They had just looked at a mountain and mistaken it for a molehill. David returned to his table. His friend, the host, was furious and apologizing profusely. David just waved it off. "It's fine," he said quietly. But his mind was already elsewhere, clicking pieces into place. He had heard of the Chadwick-Kronos deal. He knew Kronos was a powerful but often ruthless company. He had chosen long ago not to work with them because of their practices. Now, seeing the character of the Chadwick family displayed so openly, a complete picture formed in his mind. He finished the evening calmly, shaking a few hands, speaking politely to others. He was the picture of quiet dignity. An hour later, he was in the back of his car, heading home. The glittering lights of the city passed by his window. He pulled out his phone, not to check email, but to make a call. He scrolled past hundreds of contacts until he found one, simply labeled with initials and a country code. It was not a call to Kronos. It was a call to the people who controlled Kronos. He pressed the button and held the phone to his ear. The line rang once, twice, in a different time zone. "Yes," a voice answered on the other end. "It's David," he said. "We need to talk about the Kronos-Chadwick merger. I have some information you need to see before tomorrow morning." His voice was low, steady, and full of a quiet certainty. The game, unknown to the celebrating Chadwicks, had already shifted, and David was not a player they had even known was on the board. The night air was cool against David's face as his car moved smoothly away from the glittering hotel. Inside the quiet vehicle, the noisy scene from the gala felt like a strange dream. He wasn't angry in a hot, shouting way. Instead, he felt a cold, clear sense of purpose. The Chadwicks had shown him exactly who they were. For David, a man who spent his life building things that lasted, character was the most important foundation of all. And theirs, he now saw, was rotten. He arrived at his apartment, a quiet space high above the city with more books than artwork. He changed out of his suit, the expensive fabric feeling suddenly heavy with the memory of the night. He made a pot of tea, the familiar ritual helping him think. His mind wasn't on the insult. It was on the $1.8 billion deal they were so proud of. He knew Kronos. His company, Verd, had been approached by them years ago. Their offer was huge, full of promises. But after looking closely, David had walked away. He found their methods aggressive. They cut corners. They bullied smaller partners. They talked about the future, but invested in the past. He saw them as a storm, powerful but destructive. He preferred to build shelters, not ride tornadoes. As he sat in his quiet living room, the pieces connected. The Chadwick family business was old, built on factories and ways of working that polluted and wasted. Their merger with Kronos wasn't about innovation. It was a life raft. Kronos would give them cash and a shiny new name, and in return, Kronos would get their large, tired business to swallow and control. It was a deal based on desperation, not vision. David opened his laptop. He didn't hack or dig for secrets. He simply looked at what was already there, publicly available but ignored by people who only saw dollar signs. He looked at environmental reports for Chadwick factories, finding old violations and pending lawsuits buried in dry legal documents. He read analyst reports questioning the company's heavy debt. He saw news articles about worker disputes they had quietly settled. Alone, each thing was small. Together, they painted a picture of a company that was a ticking clock, pretending its time wasn't almost up. He was not a vengeful man. He was a careful one. He believed in protecting what he had built and the people who worked for him. Letting this merger go through would create a monster of a competitor, one with no ethics and a lot of money, led by people who laughed at ideas like sustainability and respect. That wasn't just bad for David. It was bad for the entire industry, for the planet, for the future he was trying to build. He thought about his phone call from the car. The person on the other end was not from Kronos. He was from a sovereign wealth fund, a massive pool of money owned by a foreign government. This fund was the single largest investor in Kronos. They owned more of Kronos than anyone else. David had been a quiet advisor to them for nearly 6 years, helping them understand the clean energy revolution. They trusted him because he was always honest, always clear, and he had never asked them for a single favor. Until now, he prepared a simple email. No drama, no emotion. Just facts. He attached the public documents, the violation reports, the debt analyses. He wrote a short summary, maybe 3 paragraphs. In it, he explained that the Chadwick merger was not a strategic move for Kronos' future. It was the opposite. It was buying a sinking ship, he wrote. The environmental liabilities alone could cost billions in the coming years. The Chadwick culture, as demonstrated by its leadership, was incompatible with a company claiming to look forward. He ended with a single powerful sentence. This merger will be a reputational and strategic anchor that will slow Kronos down for a decade. He did not send it to the fund's main office. He sent it to the private, secure email of his direct contact, the chief investment officer. He titled it, Urgent Context on the Kronos-Chadwick Deal. Then he picked up his phone again. It was very late here, but morning there. The phone was answered on the second ring. David, I just saw your note. This is strong language. The voice on the line said, calm but serious. It's necessary, David replied, his voice steady. I watched the leadership of Chadwick tonight. They aren't partners. They are predators looking for a bailout. They mocked the very idea of a future that doesn't look exactly like their past. Investing in them is investing in the past. And it's a risky past full of hidden problems. There was a long silence on the other end, just the faint sound of breathing. David could almost hear the man thinking, weighing the flashy merger numbers against the quiet, solid truth of the risk. You have never steered us wrong, the man finally said. And you have never asked for anything. This is your first ask. It's not an ask for me, David corrected gently. It's a warning for you, for your investment, for the future you say you want to be a part of. Another pause. The Kronos board is meeting at 9 tomorrow morning, their time to finalize the vote. I will make sure every member of our team on that board has read your note before they sit down. Thank you, David said. No, the voice replied. Thank you. We will talk again soon. The call ended. David placed his phone on the table. The work was done. He finished his tea, now gone cold, and looked out at the city lights. In a tall office tower across town, Lawrence Chadwick was probably still celebrating, drinking expensive champagne, dreaming of his bigger, brighter tomorrow. David knew the truth. Tomorrow, Lawrence's world was going to crack open. And it wasn't because of some big, dramatic revenge plot. It was because of a simple email. Because of facts. Because a man who built his life on a strong foundation had pointed out that the Chadwicks were building theirs on sand. And the tide was coming in. The morning sun streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Chadwick Holdings boardroom, painting everything in a warm, golden light. It was a light that felt like victory. Lawrence Chadwick stood at the head of the long, polished table, a fresh cup of coffee in his hand, looking out over the city that he felt, more than ever, was his. Today was the day. The final papers for the Kronos merger were stacked neatly in front of each leather chair. In a few hours, his signature would turn those papers into almost $2 billion and a new, powerful future. His son, Preston, breezed into the room, looking pleased with himself. "All set, Dad," he said, sliding into the seat to his father's right. "The press release is drafted. Chadwick and Kronos forge a new future. Has a nice ring to it, doesn't it?" Lawrence smiled, a real broad smile. "It does, son. It does." He thought back to the gala, to the quiet man on stage. A minor annoyance, already forgotten. "Sometimes," he said to the room, which was filling with their lawyers and top executives, "you have to remind people of the natural order of things. The real players and the spectators." A few people laughed politely. The mood was light, full of the easy confidence that comes from believing a battle is already won. At exactly 9 a.m. The lead lawyer, a serious woman with sharp glasses, began reviewing the final turns. Her voice was a steady hum of legal certainty. "Upon signature, the transfer of assets will commence, and the combined entity will begin trading under the new ticker symbol on Monday." Lawrence's phone, sitting face down on the table, began to vibrate. He glanced at it. The screen showed the name of the CEO of Kronos. A jolt of excitement, not worry, went through him. Probably calling to congratulate him ahead of the official signing. "Excuse me," Lawrence said, holding up a finger with a smirk. "This is the man of the hour." He swiped to answer, putting the call on speaker so the room could share in the moment. "John, good morning. We're just dotting the I's and crossing the T's here. Ready to make history?" The voice that came through the speaker was not warm. It was flat, cold, and professional. "Lawrence, we need to talk." Something in the tone made the easy smile freeze on Lawrence's face. The room went quiet. The lawyer stopped speaking. "Of course, John. What's on your mind?" Lawrence said, trying to keep his voice light. "The merger." "It's off." 3 words. Simple, clean, devastating. For a few seconds, there was only silence in the beautiful, sunlit boardroom. Lawrence actually blinked, as if he could unhear the sentence. Preston leaned forward, his forehead wrinkling in confusion. "John, that's not a funny joke," Lawrence said, forcing a laugh that sounded hollow even to him. "The papers are right here." "It's not a joke," the Kronos CEO replied. His words were clipped, efficient. "After a thorough overnight review by our board and our major investors, we have identified significant and unanticipated strategic misalignments. The long-term viability concerns are too substantial. We are terminating discussions. Effective immediately." Lawrence's face began to flush a deep red. "Unanticipated? What concerns? What are you talking about?" "This is a $1.8 billion deal." We shook hands. "You can't just—" "The decision is final, Lawrence," the voice cut in, devoid of any emotion. "Our legal team will be in touch regarding the dissolution of the preliminary agreements. Goodbye." The line went dead. A single flat tone echoed briefly in the silent, stunned room. Lawrence stared at the phone in his hand as if it had bitten him. The golden sunlight now felt harsh, exposing. He looked around the table at the faces of his team. Their expressions had collapsed from confidence into pure shock. The lawyer looked down at her perfect papers, which were now just worthless stacks of words. "Dad?" Preston whispered, his voice thin. But Lawrence wasn't listening. His heart was hammering against his ribs. He fumbled with his phone, his fingers suddenly clumsy, and dialed the Kronos CEO back. It went straight to voicemail. He tried another number on the Kronos board. Voicemail. A third. No answer. At that moment, A young assistant rushed into the room, her face pale. "Mr. Chadwick, the news." On the large television screen mounted on the wall, the financial news channel was playing. The cheerful banner at the bottom of the screen screamed, asterisk, asterisk, breaking. Kronos calls off $1.8 billion Chadwick. Merger. Stock plummets. Asterisk, asterisk. The chart next to the news anchor's head showed a line representing the value of Chadwick Holdings stock. It wasn't a line. It was a cliff. It was diving straight down, a waterfall of red numbers. A sound escaped Lawrence's throat, a strangled gasp. The room erupted into chaos. Executives started shouting into their own phones. Lawyers frantically flipped through contracts. Preston just sat, his mouth open, looking like a lost child. Lawrence felt the world tilt. The beautiful boardroom, the symbol of his power, suddenly felt like a trap. The deal wasn't just gone. It had vanished overnight, without warning, without reason. Strategic misalignments? What did that even mean? He didn't know about the quiet email from a man drinking tea in a quiet apartment. He didn't know about the sober conversation between a fund manager and his most trusted advisor. He didn't know that the natural order he believed in had just been upended by a deeper, quieter kind of power. All he knew was that the future he had held in his hands just minutes before had shattered. And as he watched the red numbers on the screen keep falling, a cold, sickening feeling began to grow in his stomach. This wasn't just a setback. This was the beginning of an end. And he had no idea why. The world for the Chadwick family did not just tilt. It fell off its axis. The quiet horror of the boardroom was just the first minute of a very long, very public disaster. Within an hour, their company's headquarters turned from a place of calm power into a buzzing hive of panic. Fines rang nonstop, but they were not calls of congratulations. They were calls from reporters shouting questions, from worried investors demanding answers, and from banks using cold, formal language about loan covenants and collateral reviews. Lawrence Chadwick sat in his big leather chair, but he no longer looked like a king. He looked like a man who had been hit by a truck and was still trying to remember how to breathe. His son Preston paced the room like a caged animal, his earlier confidence replaced by a jittery, useless energy. "We just need to call someone," Preston kept saying. "We need to get Kronos back to the table. This is a mistake." But every call they made hit a wall. Emails went unanswered. The people who had laughed with them at the gala, who had clapped them on the back, were suddenly in a meeting or traveling. It was as if a giant glass wall had silently slid down around the Chadwick family, separating them from the world they thought they owned. They were on the outside now, and they could only watch through the glass as everything they had crumbled. The financial freefall was the most terrifying part. The stock price wasn't just falling. It was in a death spiral. With the Kronos deal gone, the market instantly saw Chadwick Holdings for what it really was. An old company with old problems, propped up by the promise of that one big deal. Now the promise was gone, and the problems were all anyone could see. The company's debt, which had seemed manageable before, now looked like a mountain. Banks began to freeze their credit lines. It was a financial heart attack, and it was happening in real time for everyone to watch on the news. Then the story changed. It moved from the business pages to the front page. A well-respected financial journalist, a woman known for her deep research, published an article. It wasn't just about the numbers. It was about the why. Her piece was titled, "The Gala That Sunk a Deal." She described the Innovators Gala in sharp detail. She wrote about David's speech on sustainable energy. And she wrote, with direct quotes from witnesses, about Preston Chadwick's fashionable hobby, comments and the family's mocking laughter from their table. The journalist didn't just report the insult. She connected the dots. She wrote about David's company, Verd, not as a small startup, but as a quiet, highly respected leader in the most important industry of the future. She listed the major funds and governments that were David's partners. She contrasted the Chadwicks' loud, old-world arrogance with David's quiet, new world influence. The article asked a simple, devastating question. When you publicly mock a man who advises the people who fund your only lifeline, what did you think would happen? The article went everywhere. It was shared thousands of times online. News channels discussed it. Talk shows debated it. The story was no longer just a collapsed business deal. It was a modern fable about arrogance and karma. The court of public opinion opened for business, and the verdict was swift and unanimous. The Chadwicks had gotten exactly what they deserved. Meanwhile, in a different part of the city, life moved on calmly. David's company, Verd Systems, issued a simple press release. It announced a new partnership with a major international fund for a series of green energy projects across 3 countries. The financial numbers were impressive, but the tone was humble, focused on jobs and innovation. Reporters tried to get David to comment on the Chadwick situation. He declined every request. His only statement was, "At Verd, we are focused on building the future, not commenting on the past." The contrast was a masterpiece that no public relations team could ever plan. On one screen, you saw the Chadwicks, red-faced, scrambling, their name becoming a joke for arrogance and failure. On another screen, you saw David's team, calm, forward-moving, their work speaking for itself. David didn't have to fight back. He just had to keep being who he was, and the world drew the comparison all on its own. Back in the Chadwick offices, the walls were truly closing in. Lawrence stared at the article on his computer screen, his hands trembling. For the first time, he understood. It wasn't a random business decision. It wasn't bad luck. It was a direct consequence. That man on the stage, the one they had laughed at, had somehow reached into their world and pulled out the single pillar holding up their entire house. It was him, Lawrence said, his voice a dry rasp. He looked at Preston, who was finally sitting still, his face pale. That man at the gala. He did this. Preston stared back, unable to speak. The weight of his own stupid, careless words pressed down on him so heavily he could barely lift his head. He had thought he was being clever. He had thought he was putting an upstart in his place. Instead, he had handed that upstart the exact reason to destroy them. The phone rang again. Lawrence answered it, a faint hope flickering that it might be a lifeline. It was their lead lawyer. Her voice was grim. "Lawrence, the banks are formally calling in the credit line. We have 72 hours to meet the obligation. If we can't, they will begin seizing assets to cover the debt." Lawrence didn't respond. He just put the phone down gently. He looked out the window at the city he once felt he ruled. The future was no longer about expansion or victory. The future was now about survival. It was about trying to save the broken pieces of what was left. And all of it, every single bit of the disaster, could be traced back to a few smug laughs in a glittering ballroom. The lesson was simple, and it was being written in billion-dollar losses and shattered reputations. True power isn't about who shouts the loudest. Sometimes it's about the person in the room who doesn't need to shout at all. A week passed. In the world of business news, the Chadwick story was no longer the screaming headline. It had become a sad, slow follow-up story, the kind that gets a short paragraph on page 6. Chadwick Holdings continues fire sale of assets to cover debts. The drama was over. The consequences were just being cleaned up. The city's power brokers had already moved on. But for Lawrence Chadwick, time had not moved forward. It had collapsed in on itself. The elegant office where he had once held court was now too expensive to keep. He worked from a smaller, temporary space, the boxes of a dismantled empire stacked against the wall. The confident swagger was gone, replaced by a slow, tired heaviness in his steps. He had aged 10 years in 7 days. He knew what he had to do. It was the only card left, a humiliation he would have once found unthinkable. He had to ask for help, and he knew there was only one person who might possibly have the power or the mercy to throw him a rope. The thought made his stomach turn, but the fear of complete ruin was stronger than his pride. He found out where David Adebayo would be having a working lunch. It was a quiet, exclusive club, the kind where deals were made in whispers. Lawrence waited outside in his car, watching the entrance. He saw David arrive, not with a crowd of assistants, but with one colleague. They looked relaxed, talking calmly as they walked inside. Lawrence took a deep, shaky breath. He straightened his tie, though the suit felt loose on him now. He walked in, giving his name at the door. The host knew exactly who he was, and the flicker of pity in the man's eyes was worse than being turned away. He saw David at a corner table, near a window filled with green plants. David was listening to his companion, nodding thoughtfully. There was a quiet strength in his posture, the ease of a man who didn't have to prove anything to anyone. Lawrence approached the table. David's companion noticed him first and stopped talking. David looked up. His expression didn't change. There was no surprise, no anger, no smirk of victory. It was simply calm, professional neutrality. "Mr. Adebayo," Lawrence said, his voice sounding rough from lack of sleep. "I apologize for interrupting. Might I have a moment of your time? In private?" David looked at him for a brief moment, then gave a small nod to his colleague, who excused himself. David did not stand up. He gestured to the empty chair. "Please." Lawrence sat down, feeling strangely small. The noises of the club, the clink of glasses, the soft murmur of conversation seemed to fade away. It was just the two of them. "I'll come straight to the point," Lawrence began, the words tasting like ash. "The situation with my company, it is dire. You are a man of vision, of the future." He stumbled over the phrase, remembering how his son had mocked that same idea. "We have assets, factories, logistics networks. They could be repurposed for your kind of work. A partnership, perhaps. A joint venture. You have the vision. We have the infrastructure." He was selling now, but it was a weak, desperate sell. He was offering the bones of his old world to the man building the new one. David listened patiently. He didn't interrupt. He took a sip of water, placing the glass down carefully. When he spoke, his voice was low, even, and utterly clear. "Lawrence," he said, and the use of his first name felt strangely personal. "I appreciate you coming to see me, and I have looked at your company's assets many times over the years." This surprised Lawrence. He hadn't known. The factories are built for processes that the world is moving away from. David continued, his tone not unkind, but factual, like an engineer stating a problem. The environmental costs to retrofit them would be greater than building new. The debt tied to them is a chain. And the culture? He paused here, and his gaze held Lawrence's. The culture of a company comes from the top. It is about what is valued, what is rewarded. Lawrence felt the meaning sink in. The gala, the laughter, the mockery. It wasn't just a moment of bad manners. It was a window into their soul, and David had looked through it. "My partners and I," David went on, "we choose our alliances very carefully. We look for shared values from the very beginning. We look for respect for people, for ideas, for the world we all share. We build on trust." He leaned forward, just slightly. "What you are offering isn't a partnership. It is a rescue. And rescues, in my experience, often sink both the rescuer and the one being saved. The finality in his voice was gentle but absolute. It was not a negotiation. It was an explanation. "There is no deal to be made here," David said softly. "I am sorry for your difficulties, truly, but the path you are on and the path I am on, they diverged a long time ago." Lawrence sat there, the last faint hope snuffing out inside him. He had expected anger, or maybe cold gloating. He hadn't expected this. Polite, rational, immovable rejection. It was worse. It meant David wasn't even emotionally invested in their downfall. He had simply assessed them, found them lacking, and moved on with his more important work. David signaled for the check. The conversation was over. He stood up, and Lawrence automatically stood as well, like a student dismissed by a teacher. "Good luck, Lawrence," David said. It wasn't sarcastic. It was just a thing people say. Then he turned and walked back to his colleague, leaving Lawrence standing alone beside the table. Lawrence watched him go. He saw David smile at something his companion said, then pull out his chair to sit back down. He was already back in his world, a world of building and creating, a world the Chadwicks were no longer part of, and never really had been. The walk back to his car was the longest of Lawrence Chadwick's life. He finally understood the real cost of that night on the stage. They hadn't just lost a deal. They had revealed their own emptiness. And in a world that was changing, where influence came from integrity and vision, not just from old money and loud voices, that emptiness was a fatal flaw. David's company would continue to grow, powered by ideas that mattered. The Chadwick name would shrink, becoming a cautionary tale in business schools, reminder that how you treat people on your way up matters, because you never know who is quietly holding the blueprint for the future you're trying to buy. The lesson was complete, delivered not with a shout, but with a quiet, unanswerable truth.